In the previous videos, we extensively used the delay_ms function to generate time delays in our code. It's not personal, but the delay function really sucks. Why? It becomes clear when you understand how it works. It keeps the microcontroller executing a useless loop for the given amount of time, so basically, you've dedicated the CPU resources for doing nothing useful. But it's not a total disaster. We used it in many situations and it was okay. But once your microcontroller has to process lots of data or handle events, it doesn't make sense to leave all these things waiting while the CPU is executing this useless delay loop. That's why we have the timer module in every microcontroller to handle such situations. Timers are one of the basic peripherals in many microcontrollers, and they are not only used to generate accurate time delays, but can be used to measure the time or how long between two events, and the obvious application of a timer module is a counter. Like on an assembly line, we often have to count parts that go down on an assembly line. I said counters are the obvious application because when you look inside of a timer module, you find it basically a counter with some other stuff attached to it. If you're the kind of guys who skip classes or don't know what a digital counter is, you've come to the right place. I'm going through what counters do as fast as possible, so stick with me. Simply stated, a counter is a digital circuit that counts the number of pulses coming through it. Here is a 3-bit counter, which means this counter can count from 0 to 7 or 2 to the third minus 1. When a pulse comes in, the counter increments its output and it becomes 1 or 0, 0, 1 in binary. Another clock pulse comes in, the output becomes 2 or 0, 1, 0. Another pulse we're gonna get a 3 and another one we're gonna get 4. Same till the counter reaches 7 or 1, 1, 1. This number actually is interesting because we hit the maximum number this counter can handle. So when another clock pulse comes in, the counter overflows and rolls back to 0. Not quite useful unless there is another bit that tells the CPU the counter overflowed and ran out of bits, so we know that the counter is going back to 0. So far we've seen how counters can work as counters, not timers. We don't need to add more digital blocks to make up a timer. We only need to have a pulse that comes in fixed time intervals. Say for example every 1 millisecond. So the counter would increment exactly every 1 millisecond. So after 3 pulses we know that 3 milliseconds elapsed, and after 7 clock pulses 7 milliseconds went by. So we have a fixed overflow time of 8 milliseconds. Because we count the pulses that made the counter overflowed, then the counter triggers an interrupt once it overflows, and we can do some stuff every 8 milliseconds in the ISR. So far so good, we've made a timer, but with a fixed overflow time. We cannot take this 8 millisecond or whatever fixed delay and use it in every situation. We gotta figure out a way to change the overflow period. One option is to change the period of the incoming pulse. So if you want a 16 millisecond delay, we use a 2 millisecond pulse since 2 times 8 is 16. Simple idea, but not practical. The clock that feeds the counter is a microcontroller main clock, which comes from the oscillator we've connected. And it's something we don't want to change, and sometimes we cannot change. So we ran out of solutions? No. We make use of something called a prescaler. A prescaler is a digital circuit again that can divide the incoming clock by a fixed ratio that we control in software. If we inserted a prescaler that can divide the clock feeding the counter by either 1, 2, or 4 like this, note that we're dividing the frequency, so technically we're multiplying the period of the clock. If we input a 1 millisecond clock to the prescaler, we can have a 1 millisecond, 2 millisecond, or 4 millisecond clock comes out as output and increments the counter. So we've raised the number of delay options to 3. Doing simple math, we can have an overflow time of 8 milliseconds, 16 milliseconds, or 32 milliseconds. Seems like we've done nothing. Unless we can force the counter to begin counting from a specific number and not necessarily 0, we cannot have a handy timer module. So let's suppose we wanted the timer to overflow every 5 milliseconds. We still have the 1 millisecond clock pulse coming inside the counter, so we start the counting sequence from 3, not 0. So the counter reaches 7 and overflows after the 5th pulse, or 5 milliseconds. Then rolls over to 0, we preload it with 3 again and repeat the cycle. Another example, we want an overflow period of 10 milliseconds. It's greater than 8 milliseconds, so we use a prescaler to divide the 1 millisecond clock by 2, and we have a 2 millisecond clock pulse coming inside the counter. So we gonna get the counter increment every 2 milliseconds. So how can we find the starting values that we are going to preload the timer with? We follow this equation. T overflow, this is the delay we want, equals T clock, this is the clock without the prescale value, here it's 1 millisecond, times the prescale, which is 2, times 2 to the third, which is 8, minus the preload. We solve for the preload value and we get 3 again. This is easy math but needs some sort of thinking, so you can pause the video and understand this equation well. Now we have a solid background on timers and we can deal with any timer in PIC microcontroller. So let's take a look inside of the datasheet and see what timers inside this microcontroller. We open the datasheet. We find 4 timer modules inside of this microcontroller: timer 0, timer 1, timer 2, and timer 3. The working principle of all of these timers is exactly the same. The only difference is the options they offer. Some timers are 16 bits, some have prescalers, others have bigger prescalers. So let's focus on timer 0, and you can easily go and apply it to other timers. It can be a 16-bit or 8-bit timer. The number of bits here refer to the size of the timer counter. If it's an 8-bit mode, then the timer counter can count from 0 to 255. If it's in 16-bit mode, it can count up to 2 to the 16th minus 1, which is 65535, which gives longer delay periods, a prescaler, selectable clock source, and this one is interesting. I said timers can be either timers or counters. When the clock source is a CPU clock, it's a timer. When the counter increments on external pulses coming through a GPIO pin, the timer works as a counter. Other than that, counters or timers work exactly the same. No surprise, there is an interrupt bit that notifies you when the timer counter overflows. Scrolling down, we see the timer block diagram. This is the first time we study a module diagram because it's the first time we deal with a module in this microcontroller. Don't get scared by this complicated looking diagram, but individual parts are pretty simple, so we go through each one of them to get the whole picture. First block here is a multiplexer or a MUX. A MUX is nothing but a digital circuit with multiple inputs and a single output, and the output is one of these inputs depending on a selecting bit. Here it's T0 CS or timer 0 clock select. As this bit is 0, the timer counter takes its clock from the CPU clock and it operates as a timer. If it's 1, the timer counter operates on the pulses coming into our A4 pin and it's a counter. Then we move to the prescaler block. It divides the clock by 2, 4, 8, and so on up to 256. This basically slows down the clock feeding the counter so we can have longer delay periods. So some may stop and think, why not fixing the prescaler to divide by the largest value, say 256 here? Okay, good point. Of course, a bigger prescale value gives a longer overflow time but less resolution. Say we have a 1 microsecond CPU clock, we set a prescaler of 256, so the counter increments each 256 microsecond, and we can only get an overflow time that's multiples of 256 microseconds. like 512, 1024, and so on. But you cannot have a 400 microsecond delay, for example, or even something close to that. But if you set a prescale of 8, you have better resolution. You can get delays of 16, 32, and even 400 microseconds exactly, because 400 is a multiple of 8. Bottom line is, it's a compromise. You should stick with the smallest prescaler values that can get you the overflow time you desire. These bits T0 PS0 to T0 PS2 are used to select the prescaler value. Then another mux, and this one is used to select between having the CPU clock as it is or having it divided by the prescaler you choose. You set it to 1, you get the original CPU clock, clear it, and you have the CPU clock divided by some ratio. And here is the timer counter register. It's a 16-bit register, but since it's an 8-bit microcontroller, this 16-bit register is a 2 back-to-back 8-bit registers. You can think of it as TMR0L holds the low 8 bits of the whole register, and TMR0H holds the high 8 bits. This register works exactly as a 3-bit counter we talked about in the first part of the video, except it can be a 16-bit or 8-bit counter. It increments on each clock coming in. When it reaches all ones, it triggers an interrupt and sets TMR0IF like bit. Then it goes back to all zeros and increments again. This module, like any other peripheral, has a control register that determines the way it operates. This register is T0 con register. The MSP here is TMR0 on bit. It can turn the timer counter on or off. When it's 1, the timer counter increments on each clock comes in. When it's 0, the timer counter doesn't care if there are clock pulses goes in, the counter won't increment. The T0 8-bit, you can select the 8-bit or the 16-bit mode. When in 8-bit mode, you can work only with TMR0L register. T0CS to select between timer mode and counter mode. T0SE, this bit we're not gonna concern ourselves with. You can read about it on your own, we're not gonna use it here. PSA, select between the clock without division or the divided clock. These are the prescaler bits you can use to select between all these prescale values. Here's the other registers involved with timer 0. Timer 0L, timer 0H, we already know these. Intercom register that we know holds the TMR0IE, the bit used to enable timer 0 interrupt, so you have the flag bit TMR0IF set when the timer counter overflows. That's enough for this lesson. In the next video, I'm gonna show you how to get all this knowledge together to obtain the most accurate time delays out of timers, and I'm gonna give you some pro tips on how to write efficient interrupt routines so you never get the ISR messing up your code. So don't forget to hit the subscribe button and give it a thumbs up. Peace.